Hey, happy Friday. Have you been in search of the perfect mix of Buffy the Vampire Slayer meets The Rest of Us Just Live Here? You're looking for the apocalypse, but you want quips along the way. Well, I have you covered this week. We are talking about Dead Things Are Closer Than They Appear by Robin Wasley, a new YA apocalypse fantasy for the rest of us. This follows our protagonist Sid, who grows up in a tourist town, but the spin of this tourist town is that her town is famous for its magic. Or more accurately, the fact that it has magic locked away. It still has kind of like ghostly remnants of magic floating around that brings people into this town, but the actual power is guarded by a group of, aptly enough, guardians who protect a series of keys that keeps this magic from being released. But magic is the least of Sid's problems at the beginning of this book. When we meet her, more pressing is the line out the door of the coffee shop because it's raining today, and a little bit more acutely, the fact that she has had a falling out with her best friend and her best friend's new boyfriend, who also used to be her friend, but also used to be her crush, to the point where Sid wrote him a love letter, essentially, only to find out that he was actually in love with her best friend. Something that Sid feels is a kind of a reoccurring thing, but it doesn't end there because this guy also shared this letter with his team, and so she has become the butt of the joke for a lot of people, and in the fallout of this has also lost her best friend. So she is feeling alone and frustrated, but one of the people that makes her feel less alone in this world is her brother Maddie. So when one weekend Maddie gets a mysterious phone call while they're having a movie night, he goes off and doesn't return. And in the meantime, the zombie apocalypse breaks out, which leads to Sid realizing that Maddie is actually one of the guardians of the town, and she ends up connecting with the rest of the guardians who are on the search for Maddie in an effort to protect herself and find her brother. And one of these guardians is Brian, who we meet briefly after her shift at the coffee shop, and she actually has a lot in common with Brian, including their blended families, but they are soon venturing forth into this world that is falling apart to fight the bad guy, save the day, collect the keys, what have you. And soon, with this release of magic, people are developing powers of their own that kind of reflect their innermost selves in some ways as well. And so Sid is discovering herself in her hunt for her brother, as well as her hunt for her former best friend, because she can't get Nell out of her mind and Nell's safety out of her mind either. And so we have this combination of new romance, family ties and bonds, found family and friendship, and the kind of navigation of complex friendships, especially in these teen years where things get so messy. And all of it is accomplished with a lot of quirk, a lot of banter, and a lot of action sequences. So if you like Buffy, like I said, I think this would be perfect for you, especially as it seems like an evolution of a lot of things in Buffy stylistically, especially in terms of the tone. And we are following Sid, who again is kind of an everyman in some ways, or at least she is a reflection of our most insecure selves. And in some ways, especially early on, it is possible for this to read like a not other girls scenario, but I think that that's handled in a really delightful way in terms of Sid's progression as a character, especially with that being tied in with the tone itself. Because yes, it is a little Buffy, but also it kind of harkens back for me as a reader to young adult when I was, you know, a real young adult. Things like Meg Cabot, E. Lockhart, just with zombies, though Meg Cabot, of course, did dabble in the paranormal as well. And I am, of course, talking about the boyfriend list era E. Lockhart, not We Were Liars era E. Lockhart. But it has this tone, and I worried at first that it was going to become a little much to me because I'm someone that grew up, came of age with Buffy, and I really respond well to banter and snark and that kind of quippiness in language. But I also have then found myself recently sometimes balking and pushing against what I thought I liked in that, as I find that some books are relying too heavily on that banter and not having as much progression in terms of the characters or the plot, and it's just kind of covering up a lot of the work of the book. It's a lot of hand waving in terms of tone and voice. So here I was a little nervous about that, especially in consideration of the length of this book, because it is 400 pages, and 400 pages of banter. Banter is hard to sustain and to kind of keep the momentum going for. So I was a little nervous, I'm not gonna lie to you, but I think it progressed really well. And again, it was part of this idea of how Sid was progressing as a character, because in some ways, this banter is a deflection tool, right? She is afraid of being hurt. A lot of her insecurities kind of stem back to the idea of not being chosen, this idea that no one ever picks her, and her fear that she will never be picked. And not in a way where that presents itself as a pick-me attitude, which is also very real for teen girls. A lot of teen girls go through a not like other girls phase. So as much as I as an adult want to sit here and critique that presentation, it also is still incredibly relevant for teens and development at this time. And so we're watching this character who is sitting in a lot of really justifiable hurt push back against that amidst the end of the world. And so we have these oversized outside circumstances that are informing and reflecting the interior journey here. And so we start out with a character who's very relatable in that I am looked over, I am not picked, I'm not as cool or as enigmatic as my friend. I am the person that they come to ask out my friend. I am always the sidekick. That kind of hit me a little bit in that I frequently kind of present myself as the quirky sidekick in some ways in terms of these archetypes and just what we claim for ourselves. And it was able to kind of tap in to some of those teen emotions that have lingered in some ways, but then it is complicating those. And so we're seeing a Sid that feels left behind. We're seeing a Sid who feels abandoned by her friends, but then we're seeing a Sid who has also abandoned her friends in turn. And we see a complication of what she thinks the circumstances of the breakdown of that friendship are, and how it's complicated for everyone involved in that scenario. The idea as a teen boy that if you are presented with a love letter, how do you handle that? Who do you turn to process those feelings? How do you process those feelings? If you are a shy friend who has a crush on the boy you know your friend has a crush on, how do you handle that? How do you perceive yourself in a friendship versus how does your friend perceive you in a friendship, and what does that look like? And I think the complexity of female friendships, especially in the teen years, is so important to really explore. We talked earlier this year about Mean Girls and revisiting queen bees and wannabes, and I think it's easy to forget how kind of tempestuous those relationships are and how easy friendships can break down and how that can linger with you. I remember just shifting friend groups in middle school and feeling left behind by who I thought was my best friend in a way that was surely natural progression and just kind of shifting at that age range, but how devastating that feels, and how, especially at this age, the immediacy of that, and how Sid presents it too, and that they have been friends for a decade since elementary school. And so how these friendships and our perceptions of ourselves can shift in this time of young adulthood and as we are coming into our own. And so to see that relationship, which admittedly I think is handled the most in the second half of the book, we know that things are rocky at the beginning. It's established in the first chapter, and we know that when Sid is venturing off with Brian and the other guardians, that she is also hunting for Nell, but we really get most of the kind of reversal of expectation of that relationship, the complication of what the reality of that relationship is in the second half of the book, which also makes sense because by that point, Sid has discovered more about herself. She's more open to hearing where her faults lie because she has by this point also realized where she has power. And so in stepping into that power, she's able to view that complexity. And I also really enjoy that complication because then it presents a really full character that is flawed, right? It's not just your quirky, not like other girls kind of character that is, she's clumsy. That's her fault, right? She falls down sometimes. But here we're looking at a character who feels justified, and to some degree is justified in her anger, in her hurt, but then we're flipping that and looking at where those reactions and how some of her behaviors are also self-absorbed in some way. And this idea of how jealousy, even jealousy in friendships, how that can be selfish. And I think it's a balance, right? Because you are absolutely entitled to your feelings, but kind of wallowing in this place of never feeling enough, which I will admit that sometimes I personally still struggle with as an adult. But how is that keeping you from also being there for your friends? And I think that that's really important. And also the self-destructive nature of that and how we're seeing that all around Sid, how we're seeing that reflected in the villain of the piece, which is pretty overt. I'm not like spoiling anything in that here because Sid has a kind of face off with the villain very early on where he basically says, "You're like me, you're very normal, you're unremarkable." And she has to fight back against that idea the rest of the book. And we can see that kind of spinning in her head and her thinking about how her actions frame against these more selfish and self-serving actions and where our choices make the difference in that. And across all of it too, she is the one with the least amount of power or no power for most of the journey in this group of remarkables in whatever way these guardians that have these powers. So it's not completely like the rest of us just live here, where there is still that supernatural action. It feels a little bit more centered than fully on the sideline, but I would compare that book or explain, I have explained in the past, that book as the Zeppo from Buffy. If the Zeppo was a book, it would be The Rest of Us Just Live Here. And this isn't fully the Zeppo, but it has elements of that. But at the same time, we're watching this really strong ensemble group because the ensemble is a hard balance here. We are introduced to a lot of characters, especially within the Guardians, and I think that the way that we focus on a really tight group in terms of the action and the movement of the piece, I think that helps in terms of the focus and the plotting so we don't get too lost in the weeds of it, and we're able to develop these really strong personalities that we ultimately don't get to spend a whole lot of time with in terms of action outside of Brian, who we love, but we feel, or I felt like we knew them very well for the most part. And so I really enjoyed the ensemble piece of this. I also did enjoy the romantic element. There is a heavy romance subplot that is probably not a surprise to anyone here, but I'm gonna spoil the ships. The ships are sailing. We've got Sid and Brian, who I think are a really lovely pair. There's a lot of that quirky humor, relatability between the two of them. Brian is a musician. He's kind of like that gangly, floppy-haired musician. I don't know if he's gangly, but that's what I'm picturing. It feels very of that age, while Brian does admittedly have an emotional maturity kind of beyond his age, but he has also been through some things. And most, if not all, of the Guardians really have gone through some things. And so part of the journey too then is Sid seeing that in the others and kind of being able to recognize everyone's grief and the hard things everyone has gone through to a certain extent, but also kind of finding her people and opening herself up a little bit. I like the way that our characters' reactions to things are really illustrated to the umpteenth degree. In some points here, Sid has a tendency to burrow and hide, which is played up to comedic effect at first when she's kind of just like burying herself in her pillow. But then when she gets bad news later in the book, she runs away and hides in the darkest, deepest crevice under the bleachers, and how that represents a really strong natural instinct for her, but also how we can see someone knowing her very well by their ability to find her there and to know that that is her natural instinct. So there are these things that balance humor and real heart in a way that isn't always easy, and I think manages it really well here. I also really like that a lot of the romance here is built upon these kind of escalating small meaningful moments, and we have the kind of emotional intimacy from both sides here, how both of them are letting their guard down to the other in some way. Now, we have all of this happening, like I said, within a 400-page span. And I will admit that there were times where I wondered where we could cut in the book because the pace was pretty steady. I didn't feel like I was slogging through anything by any means, and I really respect that we had a lot of ground to cover in terms of developing the ensemble, developing the romance and the friendships, Sid's journey as a whole, and the fact that the kind of quirk and banter of this nature does take up significant page space. I would personally argue that we probably could have tightened some of that quirk and banter, especially at the beginning. I recognize that that is really valuable real estate in terms of establishing, especially in kind of establishing the normal before we go so far off the rails. And 400 pages isn't awful, especially for a fantasy. I recognize that. But this is a kind of supernatural fantasy with a really like modern kind of speculative element. And I think that there is a real potential here for kind of being a bridge read, especially with that banter and that quirk that appeals to a broader spectrum of readers. And we've talked recently about this need for like shorter, punchier YA. And it made me think in some ways too, not only of Meg Cabot and her kind of more supernaturally minded books, but also things like Rachel Hawkins with Hex Hall or Rebel Belle, which were admittedly series, but having this potential for these quirkier tones in a kind of punchier package in terms of the length of the book. And when I say punchier package for young adult, I mean somewhere in between like the 300 to 350 page range, which I absolutely think we could have done here. I think there was that opportunity to tighten just a little, but at the same time, this is not my book and I did enjoy the final product here, so I'm not going to quibble too much. Additionally, not super important in the grand scheme of things considering the book, but it would be remiss of me personally not to mention that we do get a nice manatee reference here in terms of like some off-screen, off-page character's power, being able to see someone's like animal reflection of their soul, and it talks about someone's being a manatee and they're like, well, who would want that? Me. I would want that. And in case you did not know, they are my favorite animal. They have been my favorite animal since first grade, and no, I've never seen one in person, but I bet if I did, or when I do, I should say, if we're going to speak optimistically, it will be very similar to the Kristen Bell sloth video. Sometimes I get teary-eyed just thinking of the rescue manatees at the zoos, especially in like Columbus and Cincinnati. Anyway, enough about manatees. We've got a nice half-page manatee reference here. So I really enjoyed this book. I think it was a delightful surprise. I haven't seen a whole lot about it yet. I don't think it has a whole lot of ratings on Goodreads, so I would like to encourage you to pick it up if it sounds like it's something that's up your alley. And if you have picked it up, I would love to hear your thoughts. But as always, thank you for hanging out and listening to mine. I truly appreciate it. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.